Taki.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's actually been a while since our Select Committee, the Local Government Environment Select Committee, considered this bill. I think the Honourable Peter Dunn must have all the patience in the world, given how long it's taken to get to this point. And I had to dig out all my notes and refresh my memory in terms of all the very, very in-depth conversations we had at Select Committee around the various aspects of this bill. And it is disappointing that Labor is not able to support this bill. I think it's an opportunity lost. There is very definitely the potential in here for doing some very, very good things, from building on existing relationships, creating relationships where those relationships don't currently exist, fixing relationships where, in fact, things haven't gone so well. And there were a range of ways that this bill could have been approached. And I note that it was the advice of officials that going down the path of creating standalone legislation, as we've done here, carried with it the most regulatory burden and the most cost. And there were other ways that we could have approached this bill. We could have, under Section 5 of the Wild Animal Control Act, of course, the Minister of Conservation is able to establish any type of committee that's relevant to the purpose of the Act, and clearly managing those tensions between recreational hunters, pest control and the preservation and stewardship of public conservation land is relevant to the purpose of that Act. But of course there were concerns raised that in doing that the Minister could also then very easily disestablish any such committee, and they felt that that was perhaps too much power to be giving to a Minister of Conservation when we have a committee that everyone agrees should exist, when we have identified common goals, as Ruth Dyson said, and we appreciate that point of view. But this could have also been done through an amendment to the Wild Animal Control Act, which would have set up a committee that the Minister did not have the power to disestablish, but would have been far more consistent with the legislation that the Department of Conservation already works under. So there were a range of different things that we could have done. And I note this goes right back to when we were in government. I think Stevie Chadwick was the Minister when an advisory group was set up to look at how this might be done. Well, I think they were one of the first submitters that we heard from memory, going back into the distant past. I think they were one of the first first submitters that we heard from, and they were not happy with the bill. In fact, they said this is pretty much exactly what we said not to do, and we think that this will increase tensions, not reduce them. And I mean, whilst I agree with a lot of what the Honourable Peter Dunn said about what his party wants to achieve, what he's trying to achieve, it's not as simple when you're dealing with an area like this, which relies on relationship building, very, very much so. This is not going to work if those relationships aren't taken into account. You can't simply just force that relationship building through legislation. And that was our concern the whole way through, is there was a lot of common ground. What became very apparent at Select Committee was, between all the groups and what we might call competing interests, there was actually a hell of a lot of common ground that we could have built on and come up with a solution which didn't exacerbate some of the tensions that do exist. And I don't think there's anyone in this House, I hope no one in this House is going to stand up and claim that this bill is going to see those tensions disappear, because it will not. This is still going to require an awful amount of relationship building. But in that room, we also heard from recreational hunters in parts of the country where they work incredibly well with DOC, where they have worked between themselves to develop management plans so that both met the objectives of pest control, but at the same time provided herds of a significant enough size for recreational hunters to be able to get maximum benefit out of that, and it works very, very well. We also heard from parts of the country where it's an absolute dog's breakfast, where there is a complete breakdown in relationship between the department and the recreational hunting community. And I think a lot of it comes back to what the Honourable Peter Dunn was saying about how the recreational hunting community is not particularly well organised at the moment. So you have some parts of the country where it's very strong, certain herds which are stronger than others, but across the entire country it's not particularly well organised. And so I guess it then becomes a question of, do we put the cart before the horse with this piece of legislation? Could we have done it differently in terms of... Thank you, Marianne. Could we have done this differently? Because at the moment we're asking a sector that by our own admission is still in its infancy in terms of organisation to carry out an incredibly important task. And maybe had we gone down another path of that relationship building, it may well have been that this is where we ended up. But we might have ended up there, first of all, by building on existing relationships, developing those relationships and using them as an example where those relationships are very good, learning from negative experiences where those relationships have been very bad. We could have done this as an amendment under existing legislation, and it may well have been that we would have got to this in the end once we'd built up the capacity within the recreational hunting sector to be able to carry out the tasks that we're handing over to them. Because I don't think, particularly amongst the National Party, who represent extensively provincial New Zealand, pest control is incredibly important, not just for people who value conservation land, but for farmers and for many others. And so if we don't carry out pest control effectively, if we let that get away from us, that has enormous implications for our economy as well as our environment. So when we start to devolve responsibility away from the department that currently does that, then we have to be very, very clear that those same things, those same activities, those same roles are going to be carried out. And at the moment, Mr Ardern wasn't on the select committee. I actually wish he had been on that select committee because I think that the experience he had would have been very, very useful. And a lot of the discussions that we had were very relevant to his area of expertise. And I don't believe that we met the concerns that were raised at select committee with this piece of legislation. That's all I'm saying, is that I think there was probably, I guess, an intermediate step that we could have taken, as I said, perhaps on the way to a standalone Game Animal Council bill with its own legislation that would have allayed the concerns of those who felt that devolving those powers right now was a bit soon, that the people we're devolving them to don't quite have access to the resources in order to be able to do that, but that with the Department of Conservation, with government, we want to build up that capacity and eventually, yes, we could potentially see far more devolution of some of this stuff to a Game Animal Council. And that's not far away from where actually the advisory committee that we set up when we were in government to look at this. The advisory committee that the national government continued, the advisory committee that came before the select committee to tell us their thoughts, that's not actually very far away from where they were. Now, I note that this is, if members read the regulatory impact statement, they'll see that these are all concerns that have been echoed right through the regulatory impact statement. Under the problem definition, they say, there is no information clearly establishing that current institutional arrangements and the management regime for wild animals requires change to improve participation among the different groups with interest in these animals and their effects on the environment. Differences in values and viewpoints between the relevant stakeholders are long-standing, well understood within the sector and have not been resolved over many years. And there is no evidence that current user groups and organisations, for example the Deerstalkers Association, are deficient in representing their members' interests. So I think the regulatory impact statement itself clearly says that the problem definition that the government has done in justifying the need for this bill doesn't really represent reality. One of the issues that we spent a lot of time on at Select Committee was how we were going to pay for this. And it's always one of the more difficult things, is you can come up with new councils where there were a lot of ideas. You can come up with a whole range of new committees and councils, but someone has to pay for them. And ultimately, when the rubber hits the road, everyone wants it, no one wants to pay for it, is often the case, unfortunately. And we looked at a range of options. The government wasn't prepared to stump up the total funding for the board. There was some establishment money, and I think $50,000 a year. But that $50,000 a year ongoing, so $100,000 in the first financial year and then $50,000 in subsequent years, comes from reprioritising existing conservation vote funding. So it's not new money. It means that the Department of Conservation, which is under enormous financial pressure at the moment as it is going to have to find this money from somewhere else. So the question obviously around that is what's got to give in order to pay for this. And so there were really two main options. One was a levy on the export of trophy heads, which was the path the Select Committee went down in the end. Submissions reflected concerns that this was unfairly targeting one group of hunters over another. And that's a fair point to make, and that could again create tensions within the hunting sector as opposed to trying to relieve them. And then the other option that we looked at was to put a levy on all hunting permits. There's about 34,000 of these issued a year, but they're currently free of charge, and I guess there was a feeling in the Select Committee that applying it to everyone might again create a number of tensions within the hunting community. So I think the discussion we had around operating costs actually reflected largely the discussion we had around the bill, which is we want to reduce tensions, not increase them, and unfortunately this bill does not achieve it.
Eugenie Sage.
Pleased to take a call on the Game Animal Council.